I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's October 22nd, and we have a lot to talk about. Just a few weeks ago, if you listened to episode 369 of RealTalk MS, you heard my conversation with Dr. Bruce Bebo, the National MS Society's Executive Vice President of Research, as we were hanging out right outside the conference center where ECTRIMS had just ended. During that conversation, Bruce mentioned that once he'd had a chance to digest all of the research that was presented during the largest MS research conference in the world, we would have a follow-up conversation as there would be more to discuss. In a moment, you'll hear what I'm calling part 2 of our ECTRIMS Research Roundup. Just a month ago, I was hanging out on the steps outside of a conference center in Copenhagen, Denmark, minutes after ECTRIMS, the largest MS research conference in the world, had ended. And the National MS Society's Executive Vice President of Research, Dr. Bruce Bebo, was with me, sharing his initial thoughts about some of the research that was presented and announcements that were made during the conference. Now, if you haven't yet heard that conversation, although from the numbers I believe most of you have, I'll still invite you to check out episode number 369 of Real Talk MS, and you'll find that link in today's show notes. Now, during our conversation, Bruce was kind enough to invite me back for a follow-up conversation after he'd had a chance to review and digest the enormous amount of information that came out of the ECTRIMS meeting. And so here we are. Welcome back to the podcast, Bruce.
Thanks, John. Hope you had uneventful travels home and have settled into things.
I've certainly been trying to do that, yes. Yeah, I don't know if our listeners can appreciate the hectic pace at ECTRIMS, where there are multiple presentations taking place simultaneously. And since we haven't yet figured out how to be at 2 or 3 places at the same time, sometimes you need to wait until you have a chance to review videos of those presentations or read abstracts of the research. Now that we're a few weeks removed from the meeting itself, what do you see as some of the more meaningful takeaways from ECTRIMS 2024?
Yeah, thanks, John. So, Juan, I think just the fact that this is the largest meeting of the year. It's the most interesting meeting of the year. There were over 8,400 scientists, John, from 103 different countries that were all, and these are all people focused on revealing insights into MS that ultimately lead to cures for the disease. So I think it's just promising, exciting, optimistic to know that there are that many and more people around the world that are all focused on trying to understand MS better. And probably by now, a lot of your listeners have heard about the tolebrutinib trial. I won't spend too much time on it, but this is a drug that would be taken orally that inhibits a molecule called Bruton's tyrosine kinase that is expressed by a lot of cells, including B lymphocytes and including cells that exist inside of the nervous system called microglial cells. And I think that one of the most exciting results that was shared at the meeting was the observation from one of the clinical trials in secondary progressive MS in people with secondary progressive MS that had no relapses on average for the last 7 years. So people with non-active secondary progressive MS, that the group taking this drug had a more than 30% decrease in their risk for developing progression. And I won't go into all of the other pieces of evidence that were shared during the meeting and after the meeting. But what I will share is that I think there's a strong belief that this drug is getting at some of the really underlying fundamental mechanisms driving progression, driving compartmentalized processes. And by compartmentalized, I mean within the central nervous system, that it maybe for the first time, John, we're getting at some of those mechanisms driving progression. And I think that was probably the most exciting report from the meeting and has generated a lot of interest. I'm aware that the company developing the drug will be submitting an application by the end of the calendar year. And so hopefully sometime next year, we might have a decision around approval of that medication. Another very exciting development that was shared at the meeting was an update to the diagnostic criteria for MS. So being able to diagnose MS earlier and more accurately will change the trajectory of disease particularly for people newly diagnosed with MS. So there were a number of, I'd say, very significant changes to the diagnostic criteria that are being proposed that should help neurologists and healthcare providers diagnose MS earlier than we're able to diagnose it now. And we know that treating MS earlier results in better outcomes for people on average. So that is a tremendous development. I know the paper's being prepared and will likely be published sometime next year. And there will be a lot more on this, John, and a lot of work going into how we communicate this effectively, both to people with MS and to healthcare providers. It's a lot of thought being put into that. Perhaps on the somewhat disappointing side, the results from a trial testing the statin, simvastatin in progressive MS were reported at the meeting as well. And there was a definitive no on simvastatin, which is, of course, is disappointing. But this was a clinical grade trial that was funded by the National MS Society in the United States and the UK MS Society and the British federal government for an agent that had no commercial incentive to develop. And so it's disappointing the answer is no, but I think promising that advocacy groups like the society, the government agencies could come together and fund a commercial grade clinical trial for an agent that had no commercial incentive to drive. And so it's a model that we'll use, I think, to test other agents, repurposed or repositioned agents in the future to test in MS. There was a lot of discussion or focus on women's health and MS, a topic that surprisingly has garnered a little attention in the past, and surprising in that MS affects women, 3 times more often than men. So there was a real spotlight at this meeting on women's health. I focus on a study that was reported by Dr. Riley Beauvais, who's from the University of California, San Francisco, who reported findings from would be a post-marketing or phase 4 study of ocrelizumab or Ocrevus in mothers who chose to continue to breastfeed their infants even while they were on the medication. And what Dr. Beauvais showed that was that the level of the drug of ocrelizumab in the breast milk was very much below any kind of level that would be considered unsafe in any sort of circumstance. It was undetectable in the bloodstream of the babies and did not affect any sort of physical or other attribute that would give anybody any concern. So, of course, prospective mothers would want to talk to their healthcare provider about whether to stay on or discontinue treatment during pregnancy or during breastfeeding, but a very encouraging sign that this particular agent doesn't seem to complicate breastfeeding. And it does illustrate that we need to do more research on that and other topics related to women's health. There were some interesting studies thinking about genetics of MS, and Dr. Jake McCauley at the University of Miami had presented an extensive genetic analysis on over 7,000 individuals from Hispanic or African American backgrounds with the idea of looking at gene variants that are associated with MS risk in those populations. And they did identify a novel variant in African Americans in a region that relates to immune T cells, which we know are major players in MS. And they also identified some gene variants that increase the risk in Hispanic population as well. So I thought that was interesting and important for us to be looking at genetics and other variables related to different populations, because everybody can get MS, and understanding how MS is similar or different in different populations is super important. I could keep going on, John. I got more, but I want to take a breath and see if you've got any questions.
Yeah, well, of course, I'll say yes. I'd love to hear more. It's interesting to hear about the study related to Ocrevus and breastfeeding. On the one hand, postpartum is identified as a period of time where women are often more susceptible to an MS relapse. And it sounds like if Ocrevus can be part of that treatment plan postpartum, perhaps that mitigates some of that relapse activity.
Yeah, I think that's the idea. Now let's be a little bit careful. I mean, this is a small study and it's not published in a peer-reviewed journal yet. So we have to keep our eyes out for that and more confirmation. It's, as you mentioned, it's a tricky time postpartum because the really dramatic drop in hormones that do provide some protection, particularly against relapses in pregnancy, drop precipitously postpartum. And of course, that's a time where mother and a whole support team needs to be on their toes, obviously, and manage that really critical first few weeks after birth. So it takes some preparation. I think that would be maybe the message, John, that a woman who's planning potentially to have children with MS needs to plan that carefully, needs to work in close coordination with their healthcare provider and figure out the best strategy for disease-modifying therapy before and after birth. But I think a growing amount of evidence around the safety of some of the medications, including ocrelizumab in that postpartum period, will help drive the sort of treatment approaches during that time.
And I think even beyond that study, the fact that it became somewhat apparent that there was more of a focus on women's health issues as they relate to MS is very gratifying to see for the very reason you point out, where women are so much more likely to be the ones who are diagnosed with MS. And over a woman's lifespan, her biology significantly changes, whether we're talking about menstruation, pregnancy, menopause. These are all significant changes to a woman's body that could have impact on her MS, and her MS could have impact on some of those changes. So it's very gratifying to hear we're going to be seeing more of a focus on some of those issues.
Yep. And we don't have a lot of answers to those questions. And I know that the society will likely be making targeted investments in research in some of those areas to try to answer the most critical questions for women living with MS.
I was also very happy to hear you mention the fact that there is conversation, there's discussion already around planning how to talk about the changes to the McDonald diagnostic criteria with the patient community. It's funny. What I've observed is as science uncovers more and more information, as researchers learn more about MS, what they're learning tends to be more complex. It tends to be a little more complicated than some of the, what I'll call basic information that may have been uncovered even decades ago. So here we are discovering new things that allow us to do something like update the criteria so that diagnosis can be made earlier and more accurately. At the same time, explaining it becomes a little more challenging because it is, by definition, more complex science.
Yeah. So I think in the past, that communication aspect of all of these things, John, was more of an afterthought. And now there's a real shift in developing communication plans and considering the communication requirements or needs for all the different audiences for something as big as this, well before the criteria are published and publicized. And so there is a sophisticated plan to communicate the new diagnostic criteria to the general public, to the general neurology community, and to the MS specialist community. It's developing and it will clearly be refined as time goes on, but a lot of thought being put into that. Thought that includes contributions both from the scientific community, the healthcare provider community, and the people affected by MS that are coaching us and helping us craft those communications plans so that they're as timely and effective.
That's really great to hear. And I'm anxious to hear more. So please continue.
Yeah. So let's dig in a little bit on kind of what I heard at the meeting around restoring and reversing the damage and restoring function in MS. So A lot of studies to meeting exploring concepts around protecting the nervous system from degeneration, from promoting regeneration. There's, I think, a growing appreciation and interest in how wellness interventions might restore function in people living with MS. It was an interesting study on diet from Dr. Ilana Katz-Sand, who's at Mount Sinai, who looked at the charts of over 840 people who provided the information on their adherence to Mediterranean diet, which of course is a leading diet for cardiovascular health and likely also a diet that would benefit people with MS. That the study showed that people that didn't adhere very well to the diet had increased brain atrophy. They specifically looked at the greater use of people who use more olive oil in their cooking compared to vegetable oil. There was a connection to atrophy there. So people who use more vegetable cooking oil compared to olive oil had more atrophy than others. Now, this is a retrospective. It's looking back. And so, I think it's a hint, it's a clue that diet has a role in MS, may have a role in brain shrinkage or brain atrophy that we think, I don't know about you, John, but anything I can do to stop my brain from shrinking seems like a good idea. So I'm whether you have MS or not, it seems like a good idea.
I'm pretty sure I'm at the point where I can't afford to lose much more, Bruce. So.
Yeah, exactly. I'm encouraged by the focus on diet and wellness and strategies to slow down progression, to potentially promote rewiring and plasticity of the nervous system. And I think more support that a Mediterranean diet is helpful for everyone, but particularly helpful for people with MS. I saw a study also from UCSF that was testing whether an automated speech analysis program could help us detect changes in cognition or detect changes in mood. So they reported on a study of 168 people with MS. The process involved recording different speech tasks and then analyzing the recordings using a computerized speech processing system. And then they were also asked to complete mood and cognitive assessments. And the results showed that there were links in speech patterns to cognition and mood. So just one example was people that had sort of shorter pauses were associated with better cognition and mood. As I put in lots of ums and pauses in my speech, it's making me think about my cognition and mood right now. But the idea here would be to develop a tool that could help track invisible changes in MS. So we're really good, right, at tracking mobility, tracking walking, tracking physical traits of MS, but we're less good at measuring the invisible signs and symptoms of MS that are, in many cases, not any less impactful than challenges related to ambulation or walking. So I'm encouraged that the scientific community is focusing on these invisible symptoms. Super interesting that a speech evaluation could maybe identify people that might be at risk for cognitive or mood issues and could get treatment earlier. I thought that was a creative and interesting study. And maybe just the last thing that comes to mind, John, to just share with your listeners is, we don't talk about it a lot, but we have more than 20 disease modifying therapies for MS, particularly for relapsing forms of MS. And there's focus on understanding how and when they work or approvals and getting them marketed by drug companies. But there's also a lot of interest in understanding how they perform in the real world once they're approved. So more studies than I could mention individually, but just to share with your listeners that practically, I would say every of the disease modifying therapies that are approved for MS, the companies that are marketing those drugs are investing some of the money from the sale of those medications into understanding how they work in the real world, in the hands of neurologists that maybe aren't MS experts. I guess increasing our knowledge of who can benefit from which drugs. So we are getting a little bit closer after each one of these meetings to a more precision approach to treatment. Who's most likely to benefit from, let's say, for example, ocrelizumab. We don't have good idea, can't predict necessarily ahead of time who's going to respond to what. And that trial and error wastes time, and time is brain. And so the sooner we can get somebody on a treatment that works for them, sooner that we can get a treatment that best balances the risks and rewards for that treatment, the better the outcomes are going to be. So too many studies, John has mentioned individually, but again, just about, if not all of the existing disease modifying treatments, there are studies to try to understand better the full risks and benefits and who will respond best to those drugs in the real world. And thousands of posters and presentations at this meeting, trying to understand better how our current disease modifying medications work in people.
I think that's so encouraging. I know from conversations that I've had with people and lots of email that I receive from people that when someone is diagnosed with MS and they quickly learn that there are more than 20 potential disease modifying therapies that might work for them, of course, their next question or their next hope is, I want to make sure I pick the one that's best for me. I want to make sure my neurologist knows which one is going to help me the best. And certainly getting to the point where there is a precision treatment plan that's evidence-based, that a neurologist and their patient can together say, yes, here are the reasons why this medication could be the right one for me, takes away what sometimes is a fairly long period of trial and error until someone today actually zeroes in on the DMT that seems to be doing them the best job.
We're getting a little bit closer at describing MS in terms of the biology that's underlying the clinical presentation of the disease. There is a global effort underway to consider ways to update the way we describe MS, John. I mean, the current disease descriptors of relapsing remitting and secondary progressive and primary progressive are based on how the disease presents clinically, and not necessarily how it's presenting biologically behind the scenes. But science is catching up, and we're understanding more and more of what the underlying biology is that are driving the different clinical presentations of MS and working towards a more biological-based disease descripting system. And so that'll be another, I think, breakthrough. If we can understand what the biology is that's driving an individual person's disease, then we can apply the best disease-modifying therapy that addresses that biology. So that is work that's underway, and I'm expecting in the next year or so that there'll be an update on what the MS community is thinking around a different way to describe the different types of MS and more biological framework. And that will be also a big breakthrough for us to help identify people that will respond to different drugs that are targeting different pathways. And important, maybe quick mention to remember, let's say, for example, in the tolebrutinib trial, we just shared that there was a 31% decrease in the risk for 6-month confirmed disability progression. That's over I don't know how many, it was 1,000 people in the trial, or I don't remember exactly the number, but a large number of people. That's the average. But of course, you have people in that trial that didn't respond at all to that medication. And you had some people whose progression was completely stopped by that medication. So there are responders, like really high super responders, and there are medium responders, and there are low responders, and there are no responders in that population. So being able to identify who's going to be a responder, you can see how important that is. And so that's the direction we're heading.
It's just great to see that the direction we're heading in is first so important to the people who are affected by MS, literally life-changing differences down the road. Some of the stuff that was presented and discussed at ECTRIMS, I came back personally just super charged about what the future holds. It's funny, as I think technology gets better, it gives scientists better tools, and those tools lead to amazing discoveries. I think the velocity of discovery in science in general, and that includes MS research, has probably never been as rapid as it is today.
I completely agree. I was thinking as we were talking about this, John, how long we've been doing this, several years now, and how much progress has been made in that amount of time. I do, though, as someone who, and I know both of our lives were affected by loved ones with MS, it's not fast enough, right? If you're living with MS or you love somebody that's affected by MS, it can sometimes feel like things aren't moving fast enough. And I completely understand and relate to that perspective. And I just hope people understand we are moving with urgency and with speed, and we're doing everything we can to learn as much as we can about MS and apply that knowledge to develop new treatments. And we are focused on cures, John, as you well know. So I just hope your listeners appreciate that we understand that urgency and we're working as fast as we can.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Bruce Bebo, I want to thank you once again for breaking down the largest MS research conference in the world into some more easily digestible pieces. And thanks once again for talking with me today.
Yeah, great to be with you, John.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/373. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free RealTalk MS app for your iOS or Android, smartphone, or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes. And it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.